Okay, hi there and welcome to a video looking at some A-star evaluation points to do with the very important topic of barriers to entry and exit in markets. So barriers to entry are best defined, I think, as anything designed to block potential entrants from entering a market in the long run and making a profit. And there are many different types of entry barriers. Some of them are structural to do with cost. Others are strategic to do with the actual behaviour of existing firms in the industry. Economies of scale is one of your go-to points. Oftentimes there is an asymmetry in costs between the existing firm, the established business, if you like, that's been in the market for some time, and the potential entrant, the new kid on the block. And if existing businesses have managed to exploit economies of scale, can you visualize a diagram of that? If they've managed to develop a cost advantage, then if a new supplier enters the market, they can cut their prices, perhaps obviously take a loss, perhaps a lower profit in the short term, but effectively block a new firm, for example, using limit pricing. But there are many other types of barriers to entry to be aware of. Vertical integration, control of the supply chain from extraction to distribution to manufacturing and eventual to selling. Brand loyalty is obviously very important, having that kind of sense of customer loyalty to your product. That reduces the cross-price elasticity of demand. Oftentimes businesses have control of important platforms. A really good example there is Amazon Web Service, which has established a dominant platform business in cloud computing. Expertise, goodwill, business reputation, hugely important. Again, one of the advantages of being early into a market and developing a good reputation going forward. And of course, there are legal barriers such as trademarks and copyright and patents, the ways in which you can protect your intellectual property against the ambitions of a rival firm. So those are some examples just to set us up in terms of the evaluation. Next question is to ask this one: why are entry barriers in a market significant? Well, first of all, the height of the hurdle of the barrier will affect the concentration of a market in the long run. So typically when the entry barriers are high, the concentration ratio will tend to be pretty high, perhaps even an oligopoly, where 5 firms have more than 60% of the market. High entry barriers and exit costs, including sunk costs, well, they tend to make a market less contestable. And that's a really important market structure to understand. This then influences the actual conduct of firms, the behavior of firms in an industry. For example, pricing of products. Market power with barriers to entry can then lead to a loss of allocative efficiency with price above marginal and average cost. And a lot of economists argue that the absence of competition, when there are big barriers to entry, that could also be a negative in terms of affecting dynamic efficiency and also productive efficiency, the possibility, for example, of X inefficiencies. So barriers to entry are significant, and of course they will vary from industry to industry. Now here's a key question: are entry barriers in different markets coming down? Are markets becoming more contestable over time? Let me share with you 6 reasons why entry barriers could well be coming down in lots of different markets. Who knows, you may get a data response question which gives you just this opportunity to make these points. First of all, we're seeing the rise of lean startups. These are businesses, startup businesses, that can break into the market on the back of just a very minimum viable product. They don't want to be the fully finished version. They try and break into a market with a minimum viable product, a test product if you like, see what the reaction is, get the feedback, and then constantly iterate the product until they have a fully fleshed out product ready to launch or to break into the market. A lot of businesses are using lean startup techniques, associated of course with the journalist and the author Eric Ries. Other businesses are growing very quickly, breaking down the barriers to entry by using disruptive pricing models. They don't necessarily follow traditional pricing. They may well use algorithmic pricing, dynamic pricing, to try to price their way into different markets. Increasingly, firms are making savvy and successful use of social media to generate viral marketing effects, and that can cut the costs of attracting new sales. Marketing costs in the past have been obviously a big barrier to entry. Perhaps that's coming down. The sharing economy is growing. Instead of having to buy expensive capital equipment, there are now lots of businesses that allow you to lease equipment, to buy retail space. The rise of the pop-up shop, for example, or the pop-up cinema, is where you're leasing space or shops or other facilities. Increasingly online, businesses can make good use of open source software and sales platforms, such as Amazon Web Service. That, again, reduces the cost of entering the market. And a lot of businesses now are lean, flexible manufacturing businesses. They only produce when there's a demand. Perhaps they might crowdfund an initial product. They might go for mass customization. In other words, slightly oxymoronic, but they might be selling a new brand of shoes, for example, sports shoes, which are customized to each individual customer's needs and wants. Obviously willing to pay a high price for that. Printed on demand, manufactured on demand, instead of going for vast, big batch jobs of production, which obviously are very costly. All kinds of reasons looking at this slide why in many markets businesses are breaking down those entry barriers. Now, what's the advantages of this? This is again part of the evaluation. So if entry barriers are coming down, if they are, that's not true for all industries. What are the advantages? Well, first of all, a market becomes more contestable in the long run. And here are 4 in theory points you might want to stress. First of all, in theory, competition drives down the price. You should be able to show a diagram, for example, showing how competition could lead to a lower price in the market. That increases consumer surplus. You can show that. It increases real incomes after inflation. It can improve affordability of products for people on average or below average incomes. In theory, faster competition, more intense competition, improves product quality and also drives dynamic and efficiency innovation. In theory, competition is a factor catalyzing higher productivity and a more efficient allocation of scarce resources. At a macro level, barriers to entry coming down, improved efficiency and productivity can then make a country more competitive in global markets. So in a nutshell, there are some static and dynamic gains from barriers to entry coming down. But of course we have to evaluate. We have to offer that kind of A-star evaluation perspective. So what are some of the drawbacks from lower entry barriers? Well, let me give you 5 points here. In theory, good, but in practice, profits go down. Well, that might reduce the amount of money available for businesses to fund much needed capital investment. Consider, for example, investment needed in telecoms or water or power industries. In practice, profits go down. Well, that could lead to less tax revenues for the government. Can they find alternative sources of tax revenue? In practice, barriers to entry coming down might be good, but the rapid entry of new firms could actually lead to oversupply. Too many firms entering the market, perhaps dragging prices lower than they would otherwise be, and that could actually threaten the sustainability of the industry. If too many renewable energy firms enter the market, perhaps the price of renewable energy will be so low that actually the sustainability of the industry, of a sustainable industry, could be threatened. In practice, technological innovations which help bring down barriers to entry, they're good, but in practice there could be some higher structural unemployment, people who lose their jobs as a result. Can they find work? Do they have the sufficient occupational mobility to be able to find work? And a really subtle point, I think, but low barriers to entry, again, in theory, provides more contestability, but it's actually no guarantee that's the case. And there's a kind of line of thinking at the moment that some of the old established monopolies are disappearing, some of them, but actually they might just be replaced by new ones. So the old black cab monopoly in London's streets, is that being replaced by a new Uber-esque monopoly and other businesses like it? So you have to be careful what you consider in terms of monopoly in the market definition, but there are some evaluation points. It's always good to have a few examples of contestable markets for your exam. You may well be given some in a data response question, but here are some examples that could be used for essays. Funding Circle challenging the banks in terms of lending. Five Guys breaking into the UK casual dining sector. I love a Five Guys, by the way. Airbnb's impact on the hotel industry, very interesting case study. Amazon now setting up its own bookshops. GEMS Education disrupting the private education market in London and many other countries. Obviously Uber and other services providing contestability in city transport. The rise of the retail energy firms such as First Shell, the renewable energy company, and others. And Uber breaking into the freight logistics sector. There's lots of good examples of contestability. If you get a data response question, you have to use the data provided. But if you get an essay question, you can choose the ground you write on. I think a great example is the parcel sector. This is my last slide in this video. Parcel sector is an industry which has become much more competitive. Deregulation has been a factor, allowing more firms into the market. So the monopoly that once was enjoyed by the Royal Mail has largely disappeared. Now there is so much competition, particularly city to city, nationwide parcel services such as FedEx and DPD and Yodel and many others besides. But yet the competition grows more fierce. Click and collect, the rise of China Post, intelligent parcel locker businesses, 3D printing technology. Instead of having stuff delivered, print stuff at home, and much else besides. This is a really good example of where, when the barriers to entry come down, the scale and intensity of competition goes up. So there we go, some evaluation points on the really key topic of barriers to entry and exit. Thank you.